So I wanted to talk a little bit about measurement. If you've seen other things that I've presented, you know that metrics is one of my favorite topics. One of the things that I really like is this graphic around if it won't change how you behave, it's a bad metric. And one of the things that I see people doing wrong all the time is they capture all of these metrics, they spend this time, or they get some tool to spit things out, and when the metric changes and I say, well, what are you going to do about it? They just don't know. So a good example of that was that I worked in an organization where somebody would report, they'd say, oh, we had 500,000 attacks on the firewall last month. Okay, well, what does that mean to me, right? If you had 1 million or 2 million attacks on the firewall, would you do anything differently? Really what I care about is how many attacks got through the firewall. And I think that's similar with some of the other metrics that I've seen where I've got one client that was measuring the number of complaints and kind of emails they got about privacy. And what I could see was that over time, the numbers were creeping up. And I went and talked to the person who ran that part of the program, and I said, well, the numbers are creeping up. He said, yep. I said, when do we get to the point where you just can't answer all of these things within a reasonable time? And we went and looked at it, and it turned out that that time was within the next 2 months. So then we could actually go back to management and say, okay, if the trend continues the way it's looking like it, we can actually make a change to the staffing, we can cross-train more people. So we can go and do these things because we're thinking about what is that metric actually helping us make decisions about. And that's where I would always start with metric. What decisions is this number going to help you make? And if the answer is none, stop reporting it, stop measuring it, don't worry about it because it's not really helping you run a better program. Another thing that you can think about as well with metrics is that the check engine light, if this comes in on your car, right? So to me, this is something broke that's not important enough to have its own light. And if you think about how long would you drive your car once the check engine light comes on, you'll probably find a range of responses, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about different risk appetites. And also it comes back to the funding as well. Like if you have the money to go and take your car in, maybe you go and get it fixed straight away. But if you don't, maybe you'll wait until something starts making a funny noise. So again, when you're thinking about measuring your program, don't create check engine lights. Create things that actually tell you what do you need to go and do about it. So what I usually do is I break down measurements into these 3 kinds. So thinking about activities, trends, and then outcomes. So for me, activities are, if I'm going to say to someone, go and do something, that's an activity. It's something I can delegate. It's something that I can go and actually say, go and answer these questions, go and do these privacy impact assessments. We can then track the number of those things that you did. After you've been doing that for a while, you can start to get trends. Like I was just giving that example around, we can then see the trend over a few months. We can then use that to help make a decision. When we're just tracking activities, it can be really hard to determine whether that is actually telling us anything useful. And then the other one that I would look at is outcomes. So thinking about a good example here would be with training. So how do you measure the success of a training program? So organizations will tell me, I'll go in and I'll say, we trained 200 people last year. That's great. How many people were in the population you should have trained? Was it 1,000? Was it 10,000? 200 is great if you should have trained 200, but that doesn't really tell me very much unless I know more. If the outcome is that we train all of the people who handle personal information every year, again, how does that 200 relate back to that? So thinking about what is the goal of what you're trying to get to, which kind of comes back to the services model I was talking about earlier. Think about what the goal is of each of these things that you're doing, and then write that goal down. You may not be able to measure against that goal very easily because the outcome metrics are usually hard to measure. But in my experience, the things that are easy to measure are usually not that actually useful in helping you run your program. So metrics as well can help you communicate with different audiences. And I think it's really important, again, to think about not just how are you managing your team on a day-to-day basis, but how are you communicating with your peers? Chief security officer, chief marketing officer, anyone else that is kind of a peer across the organization. How are you aligning priorities? The last thing you want to do is go into an executive meeting and the guy sitting next to you says, well, I don't agree with that plan. That doesn't align with my priorities. You want to make sure that you've got all of these things sorted out before you then go to executives and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is kind of where we are. This is how we're improving or not improving. And then this is what we need to really manage risks in a sensible way. So yeah, use this to communicate with different audiences. But I think it's important as well to realize, and again, a lot of people make this mistake, even people in big companies. They go and take all of those metrics to executives and they say, look, we did 50 privacy impact assessments last month. Executives are like, what does that mean? I have no idea whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. And I think even with management, your management peers, giving them the raw numbers isn't really that helpful. You've got to think about more, how are you contributing towards some of these outcomes? And I think that's particularly true for executives, where you can compare with other organizations and say, look, this is how we're doing. This is how the industry's doing. These are the things that have changed. This is what we're doing about it. It's really helping to keep that program at a high level of maturity. But yes, if you go in and present the raw numbers, they may smile, but they're really thinking, why is this guy or girl here?